The growing nuclear threat from Iran and political instability in China could either shift the global balance of power. We'll talk with the experts next on The Body Politic. Good evening and welcome to The Body Politic. I'm Michael Bernstein, Professor of History and Dean of Arts and Humanities at the University of California, San Diego. As the United States marks its third year at war with Iraq, there's another threat brewing in the Middle East, and it's coming from Iran. Iran's president claims that all his country wants is the technology to build nuclear power plants for civilian use, but many in the West believe that Iran's real goal is to develop a nuclear bomb. To understand what's at stake here, we talk with Jorge Hirsch, a professor of physics, and Babak Rahimi, professor of literature and specialist in Iranian and Islamic studies, both here at UC San Diego. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us. Let's start with you, Babak. What's happening in Iran? What does the government want?
The Iranian government, all the way since actually it was established in 1979, had the intention of developing nuclear technology for the increasing industrialization of the Iranian economy. So definitely there is that one level of economic aspect that in fact actually predates the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and it's been very much the idea, in fact one of the things they argue is that by the year 2020 Iran's oil resources will be basically used up. So we need the kind of nuclear program to actually use it for the growing Iranian economy. However, there's also another reason, the political aspect, which really before the election of Ahmadinejad into power in 2005, June of 2005, the argument was that we're going to use this nuclear development as a kind of a bargaining chip with the U.S. Eventually, the Iranian government very much wanted to actually come and deal with the U.S. government. However, with the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, I believe the Iranians have increasingly become afraid of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan and Iraq. And definitely, I think they are heading, or at least have the intention of developing nuclear weapons. Now, the argument is that are they going to actually acquire? I very much doubt it. In fact,
that yes, brings up an interesting point for Jorge. You're a physicist. You can explain the difference between nuclear development for power and for weapons. And could Iran, conceivably, as Babak suggests, pursue one but not the other goal?
Let me try and explain, because I think that the surest way to ensure that Iran is not going to have a nuclear weapon is to let Iran have a civilian nuclear program, because you need enriched uranium at the 3% level to run a civilian reactor. Natural uranium is at the 0.7%, and for a nuclear bomb you need 90%. So from 0.7% to 3% is a small step. From 3% to 90% is a huge step. Iran, under supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency, would not be able to do this. Now, if we don't let Iran do this and they go clandestinely and they do it, well, it will take them, who knows, but the best way to ensure that it's not going to happen is to have inspections there and let them have what under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is their right, which is to have civilian nuclear power.
Use. Babak, you recently traveled in Iran. You've had a chance to speak with civilians there. What's their take on this argument between the United States and their country?
Sure, they're very much looking at this as a nationalistic issue, something that predates also the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Going back to the 1953 CIA-led coup d'etat of Iran, which overthrew the popularly elected government of Mr. Mossadegh, and they're very much seeing this in that very much the same spirit, that the U.S. is intervening with Iran's domestic politics, and this is something we should stop. I remember I was traveling in the southern province of Ahvaz in Iran, and I came across an Iranian man. I was just talking to him, and he very much, I actually asked him, what would happen? What do you think about this? It's like, quite frankly, I do not like the Iranian government, but at the same time, this is my government, and no matter what, this is my business, and if actually the U.S. does intervene militaristically, I will definitely give up my life to defend the Iranian nation. So there's a lot of nationalism involved in this whole issue.
Pride. Yeah. Jorge, I understand that you and some 1,500 colleagues, other physicists, have signed a petition relating to this matter. Could you explain that?
Yes, we got very concerned because there was some news back in September about the new U.S. nuclear weapons policies, which actually has been going on for several years, since 2001. The U.S. has defined a new approach to nuclear weapons where basically it states that it will use nuclear weapons to dissuade other countries from undertaking programs that the US doesn't agree with. Now, what that means in practice is that they are opening the door to using nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear country like Iran. And so that got many people very concerned. So 1,800 physicists by now have signed a petition asking that these policies be reversed, because the United States cannot have such a policy that undermines the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that basically says we are going to use nuclear weapons against anybody.
A question about the treaty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was open for signature in 1968. There are some 180 plus countries that are now signatories.
Yes.
But you see the developments here as, in a sense, destabilizing that treaty?
Oh, completely destabilizing the treaty, yes. And if nations are told that they are subject to a US nuclear attack, the best insurance for any non-nuclear nation is to get nuclear weapons as soon as they possibly can. So these policies are very, very dangerous. And in the Iran situation, there is a real possibility that they could be actually implemented if a military confrontation starts.
You see the United States as being ready, willing, and able to use a nuclear weapon against Iran in the event that Iran developed weapons capability?
No, I see that this could happen even well before Iran develops nuclear weapons capability, because if a conflict starts tomorrow and the United States believes that Iran has missiles that it can equip with chemical warheads, then it could use preemptively a small tactical nuclear weapon to go against underground facilities that they suspect may have chemical weapons. So this is not dependent on Iran having a nuclear weapon.
I would disagree with that. I think we have to bear in mind also that the U.S. is very well aware of the fact that Iran has a lot of influence in southern Iraq. And I think the U.S. is also very much cautiously, even though despite the aggressive language we're hearing from the administration, but still at the same time they're very cautious of the way they're approaching Iran. And they're very well aware of Iran's influence in southern Lebanon, southern Iraq, could of course eventually or ultimately could jeopardize American safety, I guess, in Iraq.
But there's two questions here. First, is there going to be a military confrontation? And second, if there is a military confrontation, is the U.S. going to use tactical nuclear weapons? Now, I agree with you that there is a lot of problems with a military confrontation, but that's in the direction the U.S. is moving. The U.S. is not talking to Iran.
Sure.
Basically, this is going into a direction where China and Russia are not going to endorse sanctions. And just like in the case of Iraq, the U.S. may say, well, the international community agrees with us, but is not willing to take action, so we will.
The one complicating factor here in the background, I mean, the U.S. has a very troubled relationship with Iran that goes back now a half century. The overthrow of the Mossadegh government in 1953, where U.S. security operatives were involved along with the British, and then of course the Islamic Revolution that led to a rupture in relations with that country. Is it realistic to think that the United States can be constructively engaged with Iran, given all the suspicion and animosity that's had such deep roots at this point?
Well, I say still there's a potential for it, given the fact the Iranian government, of course, is not monolithic. Ahmadinejad definitely represents the conservative, hardline ideology of the Iranian government, but also a number of pragmatists in the Iranian government, including Mr. Rafsanjani, who back in the early 90s was actually advocating creating weaponizing Iran's nuclear program. So again, we have a number of actually pragmatists in the Iranian government that I assume that if this thing is going to head down to very much of a conflictual ground, I could see these pragmatists actually gaining more power and more surfacing in the Iranian government and making themselves present. And hopefully, maybe, of course, on the U.S. side, there would be more pragmatists as well who would come.
On the U.S. side, unfortunately, I don't see anybody that is expressing any interest in talking directly to Iran. The U.S. is basically setting very strict lines. Iran is not allowed to have the knowledge about nuclear weapons. Basically, as a physicist, if you know E = mc squared, you know about nuclear weapons. Iran is not allowed that. And let's not forget there's Israel also here. If Israel bombs, like they did bomb the Iraqi reactor in 1982, then the United States will become involved in a conflict. So it's not even just the United States decision.
But again, the idea of Israel actually attacking Iran, still I would have it, I'm highly doubt it, given the fact that definitely would give rise a lot of sentiments against anti-Americanism, of course, so forth in the region. And I would really highly doubt Israel would actually, probably U.S. will be the number one country who will prevent Israel to actually have a preemptive
The statements
military.
that certainly President Cheney has made was that if Israel attacks Iran, he would understand it, which is almost like saying, go ahead.
Sure.
And President Bush has said a few days ago that the U.S. will defend Israel militarily, of course. So if Israel drops one bomb and Iran responds with one missile, then the United States is in the conflict. And the question is what happens then?
You're all touching upon this in various ways, but specifically, what advice would you give to U.S. policymakers in the present circumstance where Iran has made clear that it wants to pursue nuclear capability for civilian purposes? That's the formal position of the Iranian government. The U.S. government has expressed its reservations, taking this matter to the United Nations and so forth. What advice, what alternatives do you see
I would
to this
definitely
pattern?
call out for the pragmatists in the U.S. government to step out and definitely come down to actually negotiation table and deal with the Iranian government on a personal basis, come to deal with them, try to come with some sort of a compromise and do away with the eventual and the way it is looking at the unfolding military conflict that is appearing to occur in this case. This is one thing I would definitely suggest.
Look, I have a lot of suggestions, but we don't have a lot of time. For me, the most important thing is that the U.S. does not use tactical nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear country, because this will throw the whole world into a path that will lead to catastrophic consequences. And so the U.S. government should state that these policies that we know exist are not going to be implemented. Congress should ask the Secretary of Defense and the President, what is the plan if Iran threatens to shoot missiles against U.S. troops in Iraq? Will the U.S. respond with tactical nuclear weapons? Are tactical nuclear weapons being deployed today in the Persian Gulf? There is a presidential directive, NSPD 35, which is classified, about deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. They may well be there already, and President Bush is the only person that has absolute power to decide whether they're going to be used. And if they are used, it's going to be the end of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's going to lead the world in a very dangerous direction.
But as I understand it, Jorge, the United States, as a matter of policy, has never renounced the first use of nuclear weapons in a conflict situation, as a matter of principle. Right?
As a matter of principle, the U.S. has never renounced, but it has always stated clearly that it would do it against a nuclear power or against an existential threat to the U.S. or its allies. Now, here we are not talking about that. We are talking about Iranian missiles threatening U.S. troops or Israeli cities. And it may well come to a situation where most Americans will approve such a use of a small tactical nuclear weapons without thinking about the consequences. The step, it may seem a small step and may save a lot of lives today, and then it may lead us into a terrible direction.
Yes.
And in fact, I would say a lot of Iranians that I have spoken to or talked to very much see that as a double standard in U.S. foreign policy. And of course, U.S. stands on nuclear weapons and technology as well. So I could see that to be highly problematic.
Is it within Iran, Babak? You mentioned there are pragmatists within the Iranian government. Of course, the positioning of the government recently has been fairly polemical. Obviously, various political agendas being pursued. Do you have some sense of a majority of the people actually in their hearts leaning toward the pragmatists, but in fact feeling compelled to endorse the more polemical position?
My impression is that Iranians definitely want to have their nuclear technology. Those that are against the government are also in favor of the government. However, at the same time, they do not want to see actual conflict with the U.S. They're really right now seeing what's going on in Iraq, and they do not want another Iraq in Iran. So definitely they would like those pragmatists to step out and step up and actually negotiate with the U.S. And in fact, overwhelming of Iranians would like to have actual normal relations with the U.S. So I think that's the Iranian perspective is very much consistent.
It's always struck me as ironic when these situations emerge between the United States and Iran recently. There's a substantial Iranian-American population, so there's certainly political momentum in this country for warmer relations.
Iran has agreed to enriching uranium in Russia. They want to have a research effort, and the U.S. says no research effort for Iran, and the U.S. should really I think we consider this position.
And I would say the U.S. should be very careful of the wannabe chalabis in the Southern California, those that pretend that all the U.S. has to do is just go there and all the Iranians will just throw flowers in their feet. I think the U.S. administration should be very aware of those people. And some of them actually do live in Los Angeles, and they do have a lot of, to a certain extent, a lot of financial backing by the U.S. government at this stage. So that's something I would definitely urge the U.S. government to be very careful.
Well, thank you both for coming in and giving us the benefit of your expertise. Next up tonight, the two faces of communist China, one of prosperity and the other of poverty. We'll be right back. Much of the news out of China these days is about the astounding economic growth that has largely been concentrated in the urban centers. But rural China has been left behind in these boom times. As author Paul Pickowitz has written in a new book, Revolution, Resistance, and Reform in Village China. Paul, a professor of history here at UC San Diego, is here tonight to talk about how China is dealing with inequities at home and cultural influences from abroad. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've written quite a bit about rural China. Why don't you start off by explaining the differences, the images we get in the United States about China in the mainstream press and what you see is actually going on behind the scenes?
Well, in some ways, the story of rural China is an untold story. And a lot of news has been coming out of China about economic miracles. Most of the tourists who go and visit China are visiting Shanghai and Beijing and all the fabulously modern cities with high standards of living, glitzy club scenes, and so forth. But 65 to 70% of the people don't live in those cities, and I think it's very much the case that the success story of China has been meaningful to some people, and lots of other people have been left behind, and those are the people in the rural areas. I have been visiting rural areas in China and doing field research for 28 years now, and so I have a sense of what's happening in the rural areas that we don't see, and it's pretty alarming.
You've described a rise in social unrest. Can you talk a little bit about that, where this is in the rural areas and it's becoming increasingly intense?
Chinese public security sources themselves indicate that, for example, last year they gave the number of 65,000 uprisings took place in China, mostly in the rural sector last year. This year, the number that the government itself is giving is over 80,000 uprisings. And these are small brush fires that have to be put out. Sometimes it requires military force. Sometimes people die in these confrontations. And inevitably, it has to do with peasants getting a raw deal. And one of the things that I talk about in this new book is that it's an oddity in some ways that under Maoism and under the collective life in China, peasants got a raw deal. Then they did away with the collective, they decollectivized, and peasants are still getting the raw deal. The state continues to exploit peasants in horrible kinds of ways.
In addition to the inequality that has obviously provoked these populations, there are issues around the environment too. The booming economy has caused problems.
Right, well, I'll give you a typical scenario. When initially Chinese agriculture was private, privately owned land. When the Communist Revolution took place, private ownership of land was done away with. They formed collectives. The collective system lasted throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Finally, it crashed and burned. They decided to decollectivize. But when they decollectivized, they did not return the land to peasants as private property, which it originally was. In effect, they leased the land to peasants. So the state becomes the great landlord in the sky, leasing land to peasants, which means that the land is not privately owned. So if the state wants to step in and take it away, seize it, in effect, they can do it. And the issue is there's nobody on the political scene in China who will represent those peasants. So these uprisings that we hear about all the time that are going on every single day inevitably involve peasants who've basically gotten to the point where they can't take it anymore. Their land has been seized. And you may ask, well, what's the land being seized for? The land is being turned over by local officials to developers who are setting up special industrial enterprises or high-end real estate deals and so forth. And lots of people are making lots of money, but these poor people are left with absolutely nothing and no recourse. They don't know how to express their unhappiness unhappiness, and so China has a long history of peasant disturbances and uprisings, and so that's what they do. 20 or 30 people will gather, and then 100 will gather, sometimes thousands of people gather. They'll go turn over cars, burn vehicles, and it becomes violent very quickly.
And in addition to these internal dynamics, now, of course, like never before, China is becoming open to influences, cultural, technological, coming from elsewhere. So I'm curious about how you see the impact of these new medias and new technologies in contemporary China.
Let me comment on that. I want to go back for a minute, though. You mentioned the environmental issues, because quite often what happens, China has serious environmental problems. They're trying to do something about this in the run-up to the Olympics, which they're hosting in 2008, and they want to at least make the city of Beijing a place where you can breathe the air. But during the Mao period and in the post-Mao period, there have been serious environmental problems. And so sometimes these rural deals where seizures take place, the officials will sell off the land to industrial enterprises, which are polluting, because there's very little state regulation. So peasants not only complain about the fact that they've lost their land, they also complain about the fact that the air is no good anymore, the water is no good anymore, and that becomes an issue. Now, you raise media issues. How do we find out about these things? Because even though there may be 75, 80,000 of these incidents a year, it's not true that we don't hear about any of them. We do hear about some of them. In some cases, it's very, very aggressive foreign media who are posted in China who find out about these things. How do they find out about them? They find out about them because of the cell phone, because of laptop computers. The word spreads, even though Chinese controlled media don't cover these events. Nonetheless, there are now ways for people at the grassroots to call a friend who will then call the New York Times bureau in Beijing, and they'll try to get some people down. Now, this is a rare occurrence, but it does happen, and so once in a while you get to read about these things even in our own papers. More interestingly, however, is what we might call entrepreneurial, independent news gatherers in China. And this is becoming the big story. If I was 20 years younger, I would probably reconfigure my research agenda, and I would start studying what's happening online, what's happening with blogging, what's happening with people who are simply saying, you know, the state-controlled media are hopeless, let's go do it ourselves. And by the way, it's not that expensive. All you need to do is set up a blog, go out and get the information, and tell all the stories that should be in the paper, including incidents involving peasant uprisings and government repression, environmental disasters, and so on and so on and so on. The news is getting around, but in a different kind of way now.
The government, of course, still tries to control this. The recent deal with Google, in which Google agreed to essentially sequester certain parts of its system from the site that would be available to users in China.
This is an enormously interesting subject, and as I say, some of the younger researchers are beginning to get into this, but China has something like 100 million web surfers. The only country in the world that has more people surfing the web right now than China is the United States. So think about that. As a result, the government is concerned. Chinese government is concerned, and it's estimated that the Chinese government employs something like, we don't know the exact number, 30 to 40,000 people just to try to control and filter the web in China. These are people who, and of course, they, unfortunately, I'm very sorry to say this, but companies like Google and Yahoo who want to make money in China because of the explosion of internet activity there, web activity, they are making money by cooperating with the Chinese government, in some ways by setting up search engines so that certain kinds of information you might want to identify and locate, you really can't do it.
You can't get to.
Or even worse, sometimes these companies will actually turn over the names of Chinese who have engaged in activities the government considers to be unsavory, and they'll end up in jail. So this is a big problem. But I think the good news is that even with 30 or 40,000 people working full-time to gain some control of online activity in China, it's an impossible task. They can't do it. You've got those 30 or 40,000 up against 100 million people, and growing, people who are setting up blogs that might get shut down in a few days, but it's already too late great. The word has gotten out. It's being passed around. So a virtual revolution is taking place in terms of social relations, in terms of culture, by the proliferation of the web and laptop computers and the way information is passed. Not all of it's good. I mean, some of what's happening on the web is also bad. That is to say, just like in the economy, when the state backed off of the economy back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and China took off economically, it was a brave new world out there. It was like the Wild West in terms of no desire by the state to regulate, and so you had all sorts of reckless economic development, exploitative activities, environmental degradation, and so forth. Same thing's happening on the web. The web is remarkably free in China, with one important exception I'll talk about. But that means that con artists and swindlers and people who are engaged in activities that are reprehensible are also out there, on the web. But it's nothing the government can do about it. The one area I do want to talk about, however, is this whole area of political reform. That is to say, to put it simply, I think the 30 to 40,000 people are being told, look, you people aren't enough. You can't deal with pornography. You can't deal with hucksters selling snake oil and so forth. The one thing you can deal with is if someone goes to a search engine and types in freedom of speech, freedom of religion, Dalai Lama, Tiananmen Square, that's what I want you to pay attention to. We need to get a control of that, because basically, as much as we can say is happening in terms of the dissemination of information in China, political opposition is not allowed, and the party is recommitted itself to single-party rule. They don't want political opposition, and I think this is a major issue as China heads on into the 21st century.
But isn't it true that the party, despite its efforts to reassert its authority from the center, there is some debate within the party about acknowledging some of the mistakes of the past or not, telling the truth about some of the disastrous policies, the consequences of the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, the Cultural Revolution in the late 60s.
This is a hot-button issue. This is very much a hot-button issue. That is to say, the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is monolithic or was ever monolithic is simply nonsense. Right here on the campus of UCSD, I have graduate students from China who are members of the Communist Party. And we have very open discussions, and I can assure you that these young people, some of them party members, very much want a pluralistic society in China. They want there to be political competition. They want there to be accountability. Right now there's no accountability. So when these poor peasants are suffering and struggling, there's no one who will speak for them. There's no one who will force accountability on the part of local officials. And so there are many people in the Communist Party who want there to be an electoral system, who want there to be political competition, who want there to be more freedom of the press and so forth. So I would say even at the highest levels, there's a real struggle on this kind of issue, and we frankly don't know what will happen, but I'm optimistic.
We have 1 minute left. A quick question about another dimension to this story that's so fascinating. India, another nation in the region, rapidly growing, transforming, and subjected to similar pressures as China. How does India's massive growth affect China?
This is a great question. I mean, it's a great way to end, too, because I think China is scared to death of India. That is to say, China's rate of development was extremely impressive, but the question is, can they sustain that rate? Their rate of growth economically was impressive in many ways because they started at such a low level. Now they're at a point where to sustain that kind of growth with the kinds of political institutions they have, may be a real problem. And so now we notice India zooming ahead. Chinese are also noticing India zooming ahead, and the president was just there visiting India, shoring up relations with India. India has the advantage of an electoral system. India has lots of problems, but it's a multi-ethnic, multilingual state that has done very, very well recently on the economic front. They also have cheap labor, as China does as well, but they have a great knowledge base among people who are providing services that we're all familiar with. So this is the big question. Inside the party in China and outside the party, there are people asking the question, is India going to race by us because we don't have a pluralistic political system where there's accountability? Of course, there's a fierce debate about that issue, but I think many people believe that China definitely needs more competition in the political realm.
Fascinating point on which to end. Thank you, Paul. Thanks so much for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Body Politic. I'm Michael Bernstein. Thanks for joining us. Good night.